But it isn't just the United States and China. It's all the issues and tensions developing around China's position in the world, China's role in the world, and the contrasting behaviors maybe between involving, and this is, I'm not making a value judgment here, between, let's say, decision-making and governance arrangements in the People's Republic, and let's say governing arrangements in all their various forms in liberal democracies in particular. But that reaches its sharp point in the tension between the United States and China, which of course almost day by day at the moment is becoming more intense, and it carries a whole range of risks with it. And it's very, very important that it's properly understood. To someone like me, a big characteristic really to notice is that there's a lot of mutual misunderstanding on both sides, which one can see, and obviously that's a worry. So that's one particular issue that one watches. Then clearly one needs to watch other areas of instability, particularly if they're related to terrorist activity of one kind or another. Well, for years, for obvious reasons, I've sought to have a reasonably good understanding and tracking of that. And that tends to link in. I mean, obviously there are particular areas which you have to worry about, but clearly it's closely related with a whole range of events which take place across the Middle East and North Africa. But straight away, I'd mention West Africa as well, Northwest Africa. But it isn't just there. Clearly, we've had the events in Sri Lanka, and I mean, I can go on. And so global terrorist activity, understanding it, understanding its motivation, understanding how difficult it is, increasingly difficult it is, to actually identify and predict it and spot it, and therefore disrupt and prevent it. When I make the comparison between the pressures on people now getting that right with even the pressures on myself and my colleagues 10 years ago, I can see it's become immensely more difficult. Sorry. And then I suppose just finally, I'd say, because Russia is next door to Europe, and because relationships between particularly the United States and Russia, but also one has to say the United Kingdom and Russia are not straightforward. Understanding what is happening there is also very important, and now, of course, is significantly complicated by the volatility in the global oil market.
And which countries and which people would you say are our most important allies and partners at the moment?
Well, one of the great strengths and assets that the United Kingdom has had throughout my time in this world, which is, as I've said, rather a long time, has been the strength and variety of our alliances. To an exceptional degree, we've been a part of alliance structures. Clearly, we have the relationship with the United States, which gets lots of commentary, but there's no doubt, I know from years and years of experience, that it is indeed a special relationship, that we are members, absolutely, of the Five Eyes, the famous Five Eyes alliance, which nobody used to talk about until a few years ago, but now everybody talks about it all the time. And I'm always finding people and countries and governments that are applying to become a member of the Five Eyes, to which, of course, the reply is 5 means 5. It doesn't mean 6. And then we have very close partnerships with our European partners and allies. And I'll just mention here, because I mentioned the French earlier on, France and the French services are the oldest liaison partner for the British service, going back to March 1911.
Thank you. That's fascinating, John. Now, returning for a moment to the service, what would you say are the biggest challenges facing the UK's intelligence services right now?
It's a very challenging time. I always used to think that I was facing many challenges when I was in that job. When I look at it now, I see that they've all become much more complex and complicated. And the first thing I'd say is the sheer combination of really tough challenges which are there. So we have definite challenges presented to us by potentially challenging, I won't put it more strongly than that, state actors who are out there, and they are certainly no less challenging and active than they were 10 or 20 years ago. That's at the same time, we have, of course, the continuing terrorism threat, which has gone up and down, and it may not be quite like it was on 9/11 or 7/7, but it's very complicated and complex, as we've seen in the most recent period, and really much more difficult now to identify. And I'll just mention how a single truck driver acting probably more or less on his own in Nice in July 2016 managed to kill, I think, 84 people. And then, of course, we have all that's surrounded by technological change and technology. And technology is a huge, just all-embracing factor. You simply got to understand it and be at the very cutting edge of technology. It's one of the things I've learned from history in Bletchley Park, which was mentioned earlier on. We were at the cutting edge of technology and we won. And we have to remain at the cutting edge of technology. And actually, we are very good at that. But it gets more and more complicated. And for an intelligence officer, remember, technology and cyber, it's so much of it's about information, about data, and that's intelligence. Vast quantities of it, far greater quantities and complexities than was the case when I started, or indeed was the case in the days of Bletchley Park.
So let's take it back to you now. So thank you for that insight into some of the issues facing the UK's intelligence services. But we have a question from a delegate, which by all means you don't have to answer. What is the biggest challenge that you personally have faced? And I guess we can interpret that either in your career or at a personal level. So what's the greatest challenge you've faced?
Well, without going into detail about the sort of operation itself, I'd just say that one or two operations that I was involved with, but were by any standards extremely important in terms of the benefits we were getting from them, and a misjudgment about on certain occasions about how we should behave, what we should be trying to find out, what we should be asking an individual to do, could make all the difference to the successful failure of the operation and indeed to the survival of the individual concerned. And of course, whenever that happened or came up, to say that one was conscious of the responsibility and the challenge, well, there are very few situations which can be comparable. And I say that for myself, but many of my colleagues have had the same experience. Life was full of challenges, and that was one of the things that in a way I learned, but it sort of attracted me when I was in my younger years, because the adrenaline started pumping, and once that happens, you keep going.
We have another question, and that's really around what roles, if any, are there for medical professionals in intelligence services? Are there medics involved, or are there opportunities for medics? Is it a closed world with no medics in? Genuine question. We'd like a genuine answer.
Well, that's a good and a flattering question. Of course, medical. Well, yes, and medical knowledge and expertise and experience is sort of relevant in almost any area of life. That's certainly true, and it's certainly possible to think of situations where it's been essential to have that knowledge and access to that advice, and to be completely confident that it will be handled discreetly and so on. So therefore, there is a direct role, limited in a way by definition, for doctors, medical staff actually carrying out their functions within the context of the service or the community. And then, of course, there's the role in giving advice and being available and accessible for advice, and that is also there too. So the answer is yes, but very much depends on particular circumstances.
And does the service advertise now, or is it still a tap on the shoulder? So if there are some junior doctors watching us tonight and they wanted to explore possibilities, does the service actually openly advertise? Is it fair and open recruitment, or do you still have to wait for a tap on the shoulder?
Is that a question from participants? It is. Fine. The answer is that it's changed completely from when I started. The situation I described is absolutely historical and to be ignored, as it were, except in terms of anecdotes. In fact, this happened in my time as head of the service, that when we went onto the net and we set up our own website, we found automatically that became the natural repository for recruitment. So my advice is, anybody who's interested, go onto the website and you will see there a great deal of detail, far more detail about what sort of organisation it is than was ever have been possible or imaginable in my early days. And that is the application process. And that is the only way in which you can apply. There is no other way. There is no backdoor. There is no special, channel or anything like that. It's completely fair. You apply through the public process.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that. It's useful to have that view, because there are still a lot of myths around that you have to.
Yes, I might just actually add there a slight anecdote that when we brought that in, first of all, over 10 years ago, we, on the first day that we launched the website, we were overwhelmed by the number of people checking in, linking in, and indeed also by job applications. And we had some pretty strange job applications, I have to say. I remember somebody saying, well, what do you have to, what's the basic qualification of applying and joining the service? And so I said, well, you have to be British to start with. And that took one or two people by surprise, but there we are. So yes, I understand.
I have another question here about languages. A few people are asking, because you are fluent in how many languages?
Oh, no, only two.
Only two, but you're fluent in two. Fluent, do you enjoy learning languages, and do you find it hard to become fluent?
Well, I didn't learn languages when I was at school or at university. I really began to think seriously about learning language when I became married, and I discovered that my wife was, well, I knew anyway, that she was a fluent French speaker. So the competition was important, and I had to learn to keep up. But even then, I really only learned it, when I was growing up as an adult. And although I think I am pretty fluent in French now, whenever I speak in France or to French colleagues or people I don't know, they say, Monsieur, votre français est excellent. C'est évident que vous êtes britannique. Because, once you've not learned when you're a child, then of course you never lose your accent. That's one of my experiences. But I went on formal courses, and I went and spent time there, and I worked there, and that's how you learn, living there. With Russian, well, I went to the Army School of Languages, so I learned my Russian initially in Buckinghamshire, which is not the most obvious Russian centre for culture. Then it was really only when I was able to live in Russia and mixed freely with Russian colleagues and Russian people, which wasn't really until I went the second time in the early 90s that I became more confident in the language. but of course I don't use it so much now as I do French. So I'm not by background a linguist, but you know, if you really apply yourself, you know, you can get on with
We've got another question here. If Sir John had another career, what would he have been?
Not a medic.
Is that your wife in the background?
Sorry, I'm being told what not to say. I think. Yeah.
Not a medic.
No, I have to admit.
A childhood ambition. What did you want to do as a boy?
Well, probably, you know, I was always fascinated by, you know, the school subject and the university subject of history. Probably I would have tried to develop, you know, I could have tried to develop as a professional historian. I did have an offer at one point for doctorate studies in America in that context. And I can imagine circumstances in which I might just have found myself going down that route. But it might well have been simply because, you know, I hadn't been experienced enough to see what else might come up. But, you know, I don't have regrets about that.